Um, you guys hosting this event series. It's been great, and I hope we can do this more in the coming months. Um, so yeah, today we went over a lot of the history, and like I've mentioned before, I mean, this part of the immigration process, this period post 9/11 is very complex. And I've mentioned that, I'm mostly looking at the social aspects of immigration, and I look a lot about the stories that immigrants have and the experiences and so forth. And it is a very complex series of immigration policies that came out. I don't know the answers to every single technical question. That's not exactly my field, but I'm going to try to do the best I can to explain some of these processes as we go forward. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. And let's see. There we go. So some of you may remember what happened on 9/11 20 years ago. It was something that really changed, the way that the government looks at immigration. Well, the government was already by the mid to late 90s was already passing a series of laws that were increasingly anti-immigrant. But this event really began to sort of push it in a different level. The Immigration and Naturalization Service ended. We used to know it as the INS, right? That was the agency, and then this agency was sort of terminated, and Homeland Security came up after 9/11. So this is a much more sort of closely related agency to the federal government. Well, both of them are, but this one has a little bit more control at the security level. And it's made up of the Immigration and Customs Enforcement and the ICE. The ICE are really sort of notorious within the last 20 years for doing a lot of the raids and so forth. There's also a few other areas here. Okay, there's the U.S. Border Patrol, of course. Believe it or not, the U.S. Border Patrol is the federal agency that employs more Latinos than any other federal agency, right? And they definitely do have been trying to recruit a lot of Latinos, particularly because many of them are bilingual and they're bicultural. So they understand some of the issues going on with the people. But nevertheless, it's kind of a strange reality, right? And then there's also the Customs and Border Patrol. So Customs, it deals with airports and at the border itself and so forth, letting people in. But it's definitely sort of changed the way that we do immigration in the country, and it's definitely something that is much more complex than it was before. So I'm going to go on and sort of look at some of the acts that began to happen. These are just a series of different policies that came out. The Real ID Act was one of them. So these are acts that, began to sort of crack down on the use of false documentation. We talked about this idea of false documents where there are these people who create these documents and pass them out so that undocumented people don't have to work under the table, they can get jobs. And the way that like I explained in the last lecture, the way that our employment regulations go, the employer does not have the legal responsibility to check those IDs. They just simply have to look at them. So, but nevertheless, this act really began to sort of look at that issue a little bit more closely. It required states to begin to share information with the federal government on what was happening. And remember, there's a lot of issues going on between state jurisdiction with immigration and federal jurisdiction, right? I mean, that's a big issue, particularly in the border regions, right? So, for example, in Arizona, right? The Arizona really, if we go down to this one down here, Arizona SB 1070 that passed in 2010. Part of that critique and part of the reason why they began to create these really horrible laws in Arizona was because they blamed the federal government for being inactive on securing the border, right? So the Arizona is sort of notorious. They had a group of vigilantes that began to sort of grow out of that movement. They were called the Minutemen. These guys would really they would sit in lawn chairs on the border with binoculars and so forth. They had no legal right to detain immigrants, but they definitely were mostly, they were kind of like a militia. They were there to sort of intimidate and scare immigrants that were coming through. The reason why they were there in these isolated areas, we mentioned last time that the Immigration Reform and Control Act, part of that bill in the 1980s, it secured the common crossing areas on the border. So we're talking about El Paso, Tijuana, Nogales, those areas. So what that did, formerly immigrants would come through those areas, right? But because they're now more secured, it forced immigrants to begin to go into these really dangerous areas, right? In the desert where there's not a lot of water, where there's large open areas and so forth. And they're going on to sometimes into private property, but other times into areas that are just super isolated. And a lot of people died. But the Minutemen began to sort of, patrol those areas. SB 1070 was this law that really gave, the authorities of Arizona, they gave themselves the right to question anybody by having them show an ID, right? This was kind of a racist law too, because there's so many US citizens of, Mexican ancestry in Arizona that people were just sort of being targeted because they look Mexican or Central American, right? So SB 1070 was, you had to basically carry papers, okay? And there were a series of other laws that they tried to pass in terms of social services, denying social services to undocumented folks. Okay, so just going through a few of the others, by the late 80s, the federal government passed the Illegal Immigration Reform and Immigrant Responsibility Act. And this was kind of an act that criminalized, we mentioned this briefly last time, it began to criminalize immigrants who had been caught multiple times. It imposed waiting restrictions for those who were deported so that they could come back, of 3 years up to 10 years and so forth. It also made it so that if you were charged with any type of a crime and so forth, it really hurt your chances to become legalized through normal means and so forth. And even this law did that retroactively as well. So if you had committed crimes in the past before this law was even passed, then they would come out and get you. So really, it was trying to clean up the idea the idea that immigrants are criminals, right? And we need to make sure that anybody who comes into the United States has no record whatsoever. Okay, so another one, of course, they began to pass these laws that were sort of looking at like I said, the IDs. E-Verify is right now, E-Verify, you might have heard of it. E-Verify is basically right now it's voluntary for states and companies. For example, some states have passed it and made it mandatory. I believe it's mandatory in Arizona and a few other states. But what this does is that it gives the employer the right to instantaneously check the number on an ID, so that once they apply, that number is verified through an electronic database. E-Verify is not something, it's voluntary in California, but you do see some employers who are beginning to use this. A lot of the anti-immigrant folks want to make this something mandatory, and they believe that this would completely wipe out any use of false documentation. Okay, so you begin to see the laws becoming more and more strict. The Secure Fence Act of 2006, this is just, building up higher and more secure fences. It began to, use drones in terms of searching out undocumented folks who are crossing in isolated areas and along riverbanks and so forth. So definitely there was a lot of these laws that began to secure the border in a little bit more controlled ways. Okay. The other thing, of course, is this Border Protection, Anti-Terrorism, and Illegal Immigration Control Act 2005, where after 9/11, you begin to get the equation where they are comparing undocumented folks with the possible terrorism, right? So the idea that terrorists would come into Mexico and then sneak through the border was something that the government began to look at a little bit more seriously. They began to think that this is a sort of a national security issue for once. Okay. Probably the most reactive law was House Resolution 4437. It's also known the Sensenbrenner bill. This was around 2005, 2006. Definitely, you can see here, it would criminalize unlawful presence. It would increase penalties for a variety of immigration-related crime, expand expedited removal, broaden the definition of alien smuggling to include churches, employers, family members, immigrant advocates, right? So if you are an immigrant advocate and you are helping somebody, who is come over and trying to be here to help their family and so forth, you would be deemed a criminal through this. Also notice that it's looking at churches, employers as well, okay? So really this is sort of an amped up version of the Immigration Reform and Control Act, just increasing the amount of fines and criminalization for anybody who harbors or helps immigrant, militarizing the borders, right, and so forth. So this law right here got through Congress, and then it sort of led to some of the biggest protests in US history, right? So these protests in 2006 were massive. If any of you were at those rallies in the Bay Area, you remember that they were just huge, right? I mean, immigrants and their allies were really sort of coming together to begin to say enough's enough, right? And so the immigrant movement, we went over last time, had already grown quite sizable and powerful. We talked about the sanctuary movement of the 80s and the 90s. You know, it was still going on. Those organizations had just become stronger and you know, created a lot more networks around the country. So some of these protests that happened through the immigration movement, at the time they were known as the largest, some of the largest rallies in US history, okay? Luckily that bill was shot down. A lot of it, you know, I guess you could really credit this immigration movement for sort of, you know, knocking it down and showing how unconstitutional and reactionary the law was. Okay, so a lot of these laws, you know, they're coming about at a time when the United States economy begins to crash. A lot of us remember, you know, 2009, 2010, when the economy was just going nuts. And of course, any time in US history where you have a recession, the first people you blame are immigrants, right? So immigrants were real, I mean, the laws and the reactions around the country were really anti-immigrant, right? Particularly anti-undocumented folks, okay? You do get a lot more of just, you know, hate crimes against immigrants. You get a lot more reactionary people. The politics in the United States begins to really focus on immigration. So immigration, as we know, is one of the most, I guess, dividing or divisive political issues in the United States. So it's definitely something that began to increase. You do begin to get, at this time, you begin to get the decrease in Mexican immigration and the increase of Central American immigration. We mentioned last time, part of that was because the Mexican economy was stabilizing a little bit, but most of it was because of a lot of reactionary policies that were beginning to happen, okay? Let's see. So just in terms of the Central American people who are coming, okay? Now we're no longer in the period of, you know, the civil wars of the 1980s and 1990s. But we're definitely in a new era of unrest in Central America, okay? The violence really continues to a large extent. Central America has 3 countries that are some of the most violent in the world, particularly toward women, right? You have a lot of crimes and violence against women that go in unchecked, okay? A lot of women who have been disappeared, who have been abused in their homes, outright murdered. And a lot of these, you know, these people who commit these crimes are not really being punished. So the society isn't really taking that into consideration a lot, right? As much as it should. Okay. All right. So we also mentioned that Central America, all these countries are sort of transitioning into democracies. We also talked about how a lot of these democracies that grew after the civil wars a lot of the politicians that took those seats in the new democracies were members of the elite from the old school. Some of them were members of the military. We also mentioned in places like Guatemala, some of the worst war criminals took seats in the Congress, right? So a lot of those societies, they were undergoing this transition, but at the same time, human rights organizations were really sort of still fearful of trying to push for change, mostly because a lot of these judges, a lot of these senators and politicians were still very powerful, okay? So the political unrest was definitely still there, creating a lot of havoc within these communities. Obviously, poverty was a major problem. Central America are some of the poorest countries in Latin America. A lot of it has to do with the fact that there's political unrest, but there's also a lot of problems with gangs. Probably all of you have heard of the gang violence that occurs in Central America. These gangs are very highly organized, almost to the point where you really can't call them gangs anymore. It's organized crime, and extremely violent. Definitely, the gangs are targeting youth, particularly young men, but they're also targeting small businesses and families and so forth, making it very difficult for them to sort of live normal lives. Okay. So, I mean, there's a lot of information just in terms of some of the corruption that goes on between the gangs and the government and so forth. But nevertheless, it has created a completely, I guess, unstable society where a lot of people are sort of being pushed out for various reasons. There's also an area called the Dry Corridor, and this is an area in the Northern Triangle. The Northern Triangle is the part of Central America that contains the countries of Guatemala, El Salvador, and Honduras. But the Dry Corridor also goes through Nicaragua. But nevertheless, it's an area where there's an incredible amount of drought in that area. Most of the people who live in this area are small farmers. Okay, so obviously they're having a hard time sustaining their family and their livings. So food insecurity, really, this is a new sort of issue that we can definitely sort of group into the global warming area. Okay. So all of these areas, all of these issues right here have sort of created instability in various degrees in Central America. And it has increased the amount of people who are leaving. The countries that definitely are sending the most people out are in the Northern Triangle, like I mentioned, Guatemala, El Salvador, and Honduras. And those are the nations that also have the worst problems with a lot of the gang violence, violence against women, and so forth, violence against youth. Okay, so Nicaragua, I mean, they have their own problems for sure. But for some reason, they're not immigrating as much to the United States as those other nations. I know they do immigrate to other places like Costa Rica and so forth. But nevertheless, the Northern Triangle is sending the bulk of the people. Okay. So the journey itself, man, I've been doing oral histories with my students and having them as an assignment go out into their communities and and interview people. And so since about 2006, I've collected hundreds and hundreds of oral histories of people from Mexico and Central America. And they tell these stories about the journey. And it's just incredible, right? What people go through along the way, particularly some Central Americans, right? Because they have to not only have to well, if they're Guatemalteco, they go through just Mexico, but people in El Salvador and Nicaragua, Honduras, they go through various countries on their way, right? So the beast is the train. You may have heard of that. That's the train that, you know, a lot of people, it's like a freight train. They get on it and it goes through Mexico and it takes them to the US-Mexico border. We know that this is very dangerous as well. Not only because it's dangerous to try to get onto the train because it's moving, right? A lot of people get trapped underneath. There was a documentary that came out about 15 years ago about all these kids whose legs have been cut off because they fell underneath the trains. But the beast is this train that it travels the length through Mexico, and it takes a lot of people through there. On that train, a lot of these passengers are subject to a lot of different forms of violence, right? Yeah, they definitely ride on top, like Holly says. A lot of times they're up there, but increasingly those spaces on top are being they're also being regulated by gangs. People are being asked for fares, even though, you know, they're just catching a ride on top, robbery and so forth. A lot of different dangers that they go through. So just in terms of the journey through, robbery is a common problem that Central Americans go through. Not only are they robbed by criminals, right, but they're also robbed by the Mexican police. The Mexican police have been, you know, I mean, especially the ones who are closer to the border in the southern Mexico, right? The United States, for a long time, has made agreements with Mexico and has sent money into Mexico and has sent different types of equipment into Mexico to try to stop Central American immigrants in the southern part of Mexico before they even get to the US-Mexico border, right? So you probably can imagine that the police in Mexico don't get paid very much, right? So naturally, some of them are taking advantage. People have been robbed and so forth. So robbery is something that it's sort of a common occurrence that has been happening to people trying to go across. Kidnappings, right? The United Nations has reported, you know, thousands upon thousands of kidnappings going on through various, you know, criminal organizations and people having to pay to get their children back. So kidnapping is definitely one of the everyday occurrences that happen to migrants on their way. Okay. Also at the border, you're often dealing with drug cartels. The drug cartels, you know, they've that's a whole complex story, but definitely organized crime just in terms of taking advantage of immigrants. The border is a dangerous place as it is. The coyotes, these are the smugglers, right? They're the ones who take the people from Mexico into the United States. A lot of times, I mean, the price of somebody getting over, from what I've seen from the oral history projects that I've conducted and from a lot of the books that I've read, this could be anywhere from $10,000 to $15,000 to try to pay somebody to get across, right? So, I mean, that's a tremendous amount of money to sort of pay, especially for people who are trying to, you know, get across to find find safety. Right. Rape is definitely something that happens. I mean, you can imagine that women are raped by a number of different, other, maybe sometimes coyotes, maybe sometimes in organized crimes, maybe sometimes by people who are just criminals who are hanging out at the border. There's a whole underworld going on at the border with a lot of the immigrants that are going on. One of the ways that Central Americans have tried to sort of make things a little bit safer for them, to give them a sense of safety, but also, that security of going through countries, is to create the caravans. You may have seen the caravans. These are when, anywhere from 1,000 or some of them I've seen multiple thousands of people traveling in groups through Mexico. So the caravans are definitely a way in which Central Americans can sort of safely cross through and rely on other Central Americans for their safety, and maybe even food, distribution. Obviously, when you're traveling in a large group like that, it also attracts the attention of the United Nations, who have, different forms of help that they can provide to immigrants as they're migrants as they're going through. Okay, so as this has been happening, the United Nations has definitely sort of begun a process to try to at least come up with some points that countries can agree upon that will make life for migrants who are going, particularly refugees who are going through these countries, to try to have a form of safety. In 2019, they came up with a 23-point plan. And I'll just read some of these things that they came up with, that they're asking countries. And they're not only talking about Central America and Mexico, they're also talking about refugees in Africa and different parts of the world, right? To ensure that migrants have identification, right, in case they're detained or lost and so forth. To enhance the pathways that they travel through. To try to somehow provide work or recruitment into jobs so that they have a way to make money as they're sort of going through the process. Okay. Consular protection, so get the consulates involved so that they can sort of try to provide some sort of relief. Access to basic services like telephones and bathrooms and healthcare and so forth. Skill developments to get people trainings and so forth, so that when they do get to their final destination, they have more options for employment and so forth. Have a network where migrants can send money home without having to spend so much for the fees and so forth. So these plans came out to try to get different countries of the world to sign on to them, right? To create this plan to make it safer for these people as they're fleeing danger and so forth. And unfortunately, the United States government refused to sign it. Okay, so why? I mean, that's a big question, right? I mean, it's hard to say, but I mean, in my mind, it goes along with a lot of the anti-immigrant policies that have been coming out for the last 10 years. One of the things that we see are these groups that are sort of coming together to try to help migrants on their way, particularly those who are traveling through the deserts. We know they've made maps that they distribute of all of the desert places that they could go, trails, water holes, and so forth. They pass them out on the Mexican side of the border so that people who are coming in can sort of have at least a little bit of knowledge of what they're getting into. They've passed out, you know, what do they call those? Little boxes of medical supplies, you know, pills that can clean dirty water, things like that, bandages and whatnot. But the other thing that they began to do is they began to plant jugs of water throughout the desert region so that the migrants, when they're going through there, they don't die as often through you know, the heat exposure and so forth. And the criminalization of those guys is something that's quite recent, right? You're not allowed anymore to do that because it's seen as sort of helping out people who are breaking US laws, right? So it's, as you can see, I mean, there's a lot of issues and problems that these people are going through. Fortunately, you know, there's definitely organizations that are trying to help. Some of the, you know, I mean, the United Nations can only do so much. There are a lot of migrant homes that they seek refuge at along Mexico and in Guatemala and so forth. They can go there. A lot of them are associated with the church, right? They can go there, rest for a couple of days, take baths, get medical checkups, have a meal, and then be on their way. So those are becoming more and more important to the journey of migrants. Okay. So we also mentioned last time that a lot of these refugees who are coming from Central America are unaccompanied children. Thousands of them, in fact, are coming. They are sent for various reasons, right? Because obviously children are being targeted by gangs for indoctrination into those gangs and so forth. But nevertheless, the children are being told that if they go to the border and they declare asylum, then that at a point of entry, of course, that they will go through a process where they will be able to sort of have, you know, a trial and get accepted for refugee status or sanctuary in the United States. As we know, during the Trump presidency, most of them were denied, right? One of the things that Trump did is he made a law saying that if you are a refugee and you get to the United States by traveling through another nation without documentation, then you will automatically be denied asylum in the United States. So what that means is that Central American refugees will first have to receive the legal permission of Mexico to travel through that country before it gets to the US border. So this was basically just, you know, it was a law that made it almost impossible for Central Americans to be given asylum in the United States, okay? Because of course they're going to cross through Mexico without papers unless somehow they have, you know, the money to be able to pay for all the proper travel and so forth. Okay, so Trump also reduced the refugee quota from about 30,000 or I'm sorry, about 70,000 to about 15,000. So he's doing everything to really sort of stop migrants from coming, particularly from Central America. We also know that he began to really sort of pump up his base, his anti-immigrant platform, by insinuating that a lot of these people are simple criminals and thugs, undesirables that shouldn't be allowed legal status into the United States because they're not fit to be American, right? And so this has really sort of pumped up a lot of that base, and the anti-immigrant impulse has been, super strong since then. Okay. So we've also seen the pictures of a lot of the children in cages. We've seen, separation of families from parents from their children. A lot of times this happens when the parents are detained because of immigration violations, right? And so the children are separated from them. A lot of times we know that the laws have changed since the early 1990s. Before, you were definitely given an immigration date or a departure date, deportation date that you would show up to. Now it's a lot of it is just being detained, right? Once you're sort of caught as an undocumented immigrant, you're detained until you're deported, right? So this has really swelled up the number of institutions that detain immigrants, right? And so it's almost like a business. I mean, you can see this as a for-profit business where these jails almost, or detention centers, are just being filled up with people who have been caught without documentation in the United States. There are places that we know the stories. We've read the newspapers of all the violations that happened to children there, to women there. Sometimes people are spending months upon months there, and so forth. So there's a lot of problems just in terms of the detention that is happening to these children, right, and to these families. But the situation right now with immigration is still sort of ongoing. I think that definitely you see a new surge of people coming from Mexico and Central America, believing that Biden will have a much more lenient policy than Trump did. And maybe they will, but maybe they won't. I mean, we're still sort of waiting to see whether or not some of the policies coming out of the Biden administration are more favorable to Central Americans, particularly to people who are seeking asylum, right? The United States government has the responsibility to uphold its own laws that say that we are a sanctuary for people who are unable to live in their country because of political or even just everyday violence, right? But persecution in some form or another. And even the people who are leaving Central America because of food insecurity, this is something that is covered by by sanctuary law. Natural disasters are something that countries open their borders to refugees whenever there's a flood, whenever there's an earthquake, whenever there's a volcano or something that happens. And global warming is something that's serious in Central America right now, and it's definitely displacing a lot of people. So just in terms of the closing remarks that I would have is that I sincerely hope that the United States under Biden really begins to sort of look at these, but I think that the immigration movement needs to become stronger, right? It needs to continue to push forward and make demands on the government. We can't simply rely on the Democrats because the Democrats have not always been favorable to to immigrants from Latin America, right? I think both parties have taken their stand against undocumented immigration. Definitely, we know that during the Obama period, I mean, this guy deported way more than his predecessor, George Bush, did, right? So the immigrant rights movement definitely needs to begin to take a more firm stand, and I think you are seeing that. I mean, I think that the immigration movement has been sort of, not quite as visible because other movements like Black Lives Matter have, taken a sort of taking sort of precedence with what's happening with those communities right now. But definitely it's the time that we need to begin to think about this, think about what's next for these people, and definitely come up with a plan to try to protect a lot of the children who are in danger at the border. All right, thank you very much. And I'd like to open it up to questions and maybe people who have, experienced some of these things that I've talked about, or at least have knowledge of it. Rosalio, go ahead and unmute yourself.
Yeah, well, I covered a lot of very factual, relevant points, but to me, I'm more of a class struggle, communist approach to looking at things, and the class struggle, uh, the role of U.S. imperialism in the world, in particular, and for this topic, Mexico and the whole of the Western Hemisphere, uh, we have to look at as causes for the sufferings of the people uh, in Central America and Mexico as well, the Caribbean, uh, South America, and the migrants that come from other places in the world through those areas. And the role, let's say, in southern Mexico, Chiapas, in particular, places like Tamachula and others, the U.S. is very involved in trying to not stop, because they don't want to stop the cheap labor coming into this country. They want to control it, as well as the labor in the other countries and the natural resources. But our U.S. Navy is helping build up not the Navy Corps of Engineers or whatever they call that group, is helping set up the detention centers all throughout southern Mexico, for example. And the aid that you did mention is very, very strong. The role of the churches and solidarity from Mexicans that are critical of the right-wing policies, and it seems that it's not as harsh and moving in a better direction with the new administration, but there is solidarity there. And then here in the US, it's a push and pull, because they used to call what we now call coyotes enganchadores, which were recruiters to bring people, to catch the people, to snag them and bring them in to work in the United States. And now in the temporary workers, what is it, H2 or what, I forget now, they keep on adding different types, and for different types of migration from all the different technical workers, doctors, et cetera, and I'm going maybe too long. But all of those kind of factors, they're dragging people to the U.S. There are companies that specialize in getting workers to come into, and they recruit them to come into the temporary worker programs. A lot of them in agriculture, but also are tied to bringing labor to other parts of the country, like the South. It's not just in the urban, in the factories, and in the meat houses, other places. So those are other parts of the story. I think you have a whole lot of a big, good diagram of a lot of the hot spots that are there. But I think we have to look at some of those other factors. But I wish I could have been in on it a little earlier. I think we should look back at the Bracero program and the deportation and the different manipulation of migration that were used there. 65 was important, but so were the mass deportations of Operation Wetback, which were to control labor, different from the mass deportations of the 30s, which was more a people removal part. Finished.
Yeah, I wish you would have, perhaps you weren't at the first two ones,
No,
but
I wasn't, unfortunately.
oh yeah, we talked a lot about exactly what you were saying. So those are definitely on. I think they have them recorded on the website. But anyway,
Okay.
yeah, we talked a lot about U.S. economic intrusion into Central America and into Mexico. We talked about U.S. support of these dictators who created a tremendous amount of chaos. And you're also right about the temporary workers. I forgot the W2A and W2B. I forgot the titles of those, but those are definitely those are temporary visas that he was mentioning. That that's how we recruit agricultural workers. Those workers are tied to a certain country, our company, and they have really no right to fight for their own benefits and so forth. So yeah, there's a lot of visas out there. There's so many different ones. Some of them are recruitment, based, where the worker doesn't apply for the visa, but the company does. The company might apply for, let's say, an agricultural company. I'll apply to the government for 200 visas, right? And so maybe they get the 200 visas, then they go out and they recruit those workers, and those workers are highly exploited, right? But yeah, there's a lot of problems with our visas right now.
Professor Salomon, so Jose and I work for a social service agency, and we're seeing more undocumented minors or unaccompanied minors come through, both like child welfare and probation system. And we know that 1,400 youth are in around the country, and social service agencies are starting. Do you think that the framing of looking at children and maybe youth through DACA may be like a palatable framing for Americans politically? I don't know what your thoughts are about that.
About DACA?
No, just the framing of looking at children, right?
Yeah, that's kind of a complex area. I know a lot of times that when unaccompanied children come through, they're often handed over to what is it called, child welfare, and a lot of them that are sort of separated from their family are also put into that system. But yeah, I mean, I'm not sure. That's a very complex part of the law. We can talk a little bit more about it later, but yeah, I mean, it's a little bit out of my purview right now. Any other thoughts? Yeah, Raquel. Yeah, there's a lot of. You're even seeing in the Bay Area what are called sanctuary schools, right? Where the schools sort of are little mini sanctuary cities.
Carlos, how can we read the hundreds of stories you've collected?
Well, I have been trying to get the university to pay for it, and unfortunately they won't. But I'm working with a student right now to try to get that all organized. Right now, I just have it in a large file. The bulk of them are from Central America and Mexico. And it's all people who came from the Bay Area, right? But it's really interesting because when you're looking at Central America, you do have, particularly from Nicaragua, you have a lot of sort of differences in the reasons why they came. I have some where, you know, the people, their father worked for the dictatorship, right? And they're very privileged people. And they, you know, they looked at the Sandinistas as completely, you know, insane, radical communists who were just trying to destroy everything. But then you have the other end of these people who had nothing, and they were explaining some of the, you know, the social services that came about. But a lot of those people ended up leaving because of the Contra War, so the United States involvement. But then you just have, you know, you have people in those stories that are, you know, coming from very humble rural areas, right? And then because of, you know, the corruption and the chaos in the country, they're unsettled. But usually what I do is I give them an outline, and, you know, I tell them to talk about what life was like growing up, right? What was your small town like, you know, and what was the economic and the political situation like there? And it's just amazing, you know, because you get such a wonderful view of what the small town Latin America is like. And a lot of people in Central America were in the thick of the revolution, but some of them were so removed. They're far removed from it as well.
Mhm.
But yeah, I mean, those are the real experiences that we want to get at. And I would love to work with, you know, anybody who wants to, you know, begin to put those together and make them accessible. Yeah, I think they're really valuable.
Do you have any, does it have any photographs or just the narrations?
Well, I mean, it's tough because I would say more than half of them are from undocumented folks. So when you're dealing with a university, you're dealing with what is, you know, called human research, human subjects research. And the university is very scared about, you know, legal issues. So they have to sign a release form, right? And because of that, most of them don't want to use photographs. And most of them don't, most of them use a fictitious name as well, right? Because they are documents that that the university technically now owns, right? Because I'm their employee. Yeah. But it would be kind of wonderful for the Peralta Hacienda to begin to do that as well.
Well, an artist could illustrate them, you know, confidentially.
Yeah.
Yeah, wow. Mhm.
Yeah, I mean, you know, I mean, I think a lot of them feel safe in the Bay Area because there's the various sanctuary cities that exist, right? Um, but still, they're subject to, you know, removal at any time.
Yeah.
You know.
I wondered with Rachel, what school are you referring to?
Rudsdale Newcomer.
Uh-huh.
It's on, right now it's on 84th and like off of Bancroft. It's in a really scary place, but thank goodness for distance learning. But a lot of the students come here, most of them are from Guatemala, so they don't even speak Spanish. They're learning how to speak Spanish and English while we try to learn like some common mom phrases just to help them feel like we are connecting, like staying connected to them. But it's rough. A lot of them work during the week and they have to send money to their families, and it's just really tough to see like a kid, that has already gone through a transition from leaving the chaos of their country and then coming to the chaos here. In a lot of our classes we talk about like, well, the benefits of leaving your country and then coming to a different place, like what's different, what's worse, coming to like just uprooting and just leaving everything behind. So there's a lot of working with them has definitely checked my privilege as like a fourth generation Chicana here and trying to like understand their experience.
Mhm.
But it's good. I love being around them and learning, just because that's what that's what today is about.
Mhm.
Yeah, it's amazing how many indigenous folks are starting to come, and I would say that's increasing since the mid '90s, right? Before it really wasn't the poorest segment of the population that immigrated because it costs money, right? Now you're seeing the poorest segments of those societies coming, a lot of indigenous communities, right? And so there's a lot of questions. I mean, you're right, Rachel. Their Spanish is okay, right? But it's their second language. Um, those of you who know, my wife's restaurant, we have about 4 or 5 guys that are mom speaking, primarily mom speakers, and it's amazing, just like some of these guys are able to speak 3 languages now. And I just the sort of the professor in me, I was like, God, you should really go to the university, and you would be just this incredible superstar there, and you could explain so much and so forth. But the reality of it is that they have so many responsibilities back home, right? And that it just gets in the way of that. They do have aspirations, you see them, but they have continued ties to their indigenous communities. And it's so hard if you're undocumented, because how do you maintain those? Because now, before, like in the 70s and 80s, like I was mentioning in the previous lectures, you could have this circular migration pattern where you could come and go. Now, because of the policies that the United States has put in and the criminalization of getting caught, right? People are just here. So I know people who haven't seen their children, moms who haven't seen their children in 8 years, or children who haven't seen their parents in 10 years. And it's heartbreaking, because one in particular that I knew, a friend, she couldn't go to her father's funeral, right? It was just impossible. Not because she couldn't afford to go there, but because going there would put her in a situation that if she was caught, she could never sort of come back. Well, it would take a huge effort, right? With hurdles to come back and get through a legal process, right? Her goal is, so one day this is going to all work out, right? Those processes are going to fall together. But by leaving and risking the possibility of getting caught at the border or somehow, is really tough. Especially coming back in is, not getting there might be easier. Coming back in is the issue. So yeah, I mean, those folks, those indigenous folks in Oakland, Oakland is the base, right, for a lot of Mayan communities. Ishmael has his hand up.
Yes, good evening, everybody. I wanted to, I wasn't sure what Tao was speaking about when she spoke about maybe the dealing with children and the possibility of policies that could be developed for children. But I would like to really encourage her to follow that, because I remember 2.5 years ago when they had the Women's March, that a part of which dealt with the engaging of many of our, of our children in cages along the border. And I went to the march. I was here in Los Angeles. There were probably 700,000 people, and the majority, and I can almost guarantee you that not one of those children was an Anglo child. And at that march, the majority of people there were white. And that's really important because it goes to the question of morals and values that people have. There was one sign I saw a father carrying. He says, I don't normally go to marches, but what the F, I'm a parent. And so I think that's important to keep in mind, Tao, when you think about this, because I think it's a lot can be done to develop policies, in this particular area for children, as well as, the general struggle to fight back against all of these policies and keep the pressure on Biden to provide a path for citizenship, like maybe like Urca did, or even better. But anyway, I was moved by your statement or question about this, and I just wanted to remind us all that there's a lot of people out there that are very concerned about what Trump did, and still want to fix those things. That's all.
Thanks. Yeah, that's very important. And Tal, I'm sorry, I couldn't really elaborate. Maybe I didn't understand the question correctly. But Ismail is absolutely correct. I mean, I think that would be really the next move besides DACA, right? Something more permanent and something more strategic that really deals with getting these children a pathway to citizenship, right? Because they're the ones that are, they come because at the request of their elders, right? They're sort of caught in this, these issues. And I was, again, recently I was heartbroken. A youth that I know, she didn't know that she was undocumented, and she found out recently when she went to apply for a job. And I think it was because she's English language dominant, and she speaks she speaks Spanish, but not 100%. And the families, are struggling with those questions. They're in different levels of trying to get their legal, papers settled and so forth. But yeah, Tao, I think it's an incredibly important objective to begin to think about that somehow, within maybe in starting small and then growing large, making connections. But yeah, I mean, I would love to work with anybody who wants to look at those things. I think that's a lofty goal for the immigrant rights movement. We have also Rosalio had his hand up. You're muted, Rosalio.
Your comment about circular migration. And that's true, there is trying to trap people. A lot of the immigration laws and practices are to trap people, to move them around the country, such as in the 90s, they started moving people to the south because you people were dying in the desert. The Border Patrol found ways of just moving people over and opening up H2 programs in North Carolina and all that. Pretty soon, after a generation, there's all kinds of people out there, some of them voting the right way. But but I think we can see that there are also with the forms of temporary workers working towards a more authoritarian, or I would call fascist controlled circular migration, where you buy off the governments because you'll get their money. You'll get their social security monies to you, not to the workers that were collected by the US, or that the money that goes back, that the parents send their kids over here to send. That's been going on, forever. From Europe, all the kinds of immigration were that way. So I think we need to think about it. Was They had to find more and more ways to control and to increase the amount of profits, and to increase, like this. I see a lot of this separation of families as torture,
Oh,
to
yeah.
add to the whip of deportation, and the locking the people up in all kinds of ways, way out in the middle of the desert where the army is, and all this kind of stuff. Um, it's torture also, to add to the fear of the terrorism. It's terrorism against the people.
I agree 100%. Yeah, I mean, it's become increasingly violent, and the laws have become increasingly intolerant. And they definitely, they base these policies on this idea that, the United States just can't accept that many people, right? But still, you somehow have all these corporations who are just hiring undocumented folks like crazy. Okay, so there's obviously a broken dialogue somewhere, right? That don't connect. The dots aren't connecting, right? That you can't have it both ways. There is room here, but you're right. I'm glad you said that, Rosalio, because it is torture. It's human rights abuse for sure. Yeah, Rachel, thank you very much for doing what your school is doing. That's great. I would love to learn more about that.
Yeah,
And
I'm
by the way,
actually putting
Rachel's
some things in the chat. Sorry.
Oh yeah, go ahead.
No, I was just putting some things in the chat about the school if you want to read up on it, Dow, and anybody else who's interested.
Yeah, I was just gonna promote Rachel's art. She's a great artist.
Thank you. Teaching artist, educator, artivist, I guess.
Yes. Very cool.
Well, thank you so much. That was really wonderful, Carlos. I hope we can have lots more people hear these as time goes on our website, and even have another public forum like this. It's so valuable.
Definitely. Yeah, this is, like I said, I mean, I am, I'm not somebody who typically, this isn't my area of research, but it's a course that I've taught for 14 years, right? So it's something that I really, have come to love. And, there's a lot of courses like that I teach. And so maybe we can have fun with some of those coming in the future.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right. Thanks a lot, everyone. Appreciate you coming. Please stay in contact.
Thank you,
Yeah.
everyone.
It was great.
Thanks, Carlos. This was great. Before you head out, I wanted to show you something. This is what made me want to take this. Just check this out.
Wow.
This was my great grandpa's registration card from when he came. He came in 1912, but he finally was an immigrant or registered alien in, where's the year that it says here? It's a trip how they'd like describe you. He wasn't Mexican. He was like, he's white. His race was white. And his complexion was light brown as opposed to sallow, light, ruddy, dark. Like it's such a trip how people are, how, like, it says description of registrant, And this was, 1942. Yep.
Wow.
It's the
Amazing.
form AR3.
Oh, man.
Wow.
Yeah, those are incredible sort of tokens of our ancestors, right? That they went through. Man. Yeah, I think, you know, my dad's birth certificate also has him as listed as Caucasian. And that, you know, I think that changed sometime, I want to say in the early 1970s. But before that time, all people of Latin American origin were listed as Caucasian. And I think that had to do something with the way that the early Mexican American civil rights activists tried to fight discrimination. I think what they did is they tried to argue that it's ridiculous to discriminate against Mexicans because Mexicans are Caucasians. So because we're Caucasians, who you guys can't, you know, there's no reason to discriminate against us in terms of schooling and housing and civil rights and so forth. Yeah.
To go further back, when in 1790, when Spain had a census and they got the people that were settled in Los Angeles, who had come over as recruited, really as many of them indigenous of African or Filipino background, because from the Spanish thing, most of them, after being here more than a decade, listed themselves as Spanish or were listed as Spanish.
Yeah.
So that goes back.
Yeah.
to the
Yeah, that
colonies.
got you, I guess that got you something back then, right? Listing yourself as European as opposed to indigenous.
Well, many Tonga, the original people here, had decided to, they call themselves Mexican because Mexicans at least had some civil rights.
Oh
and
yeah,
they had
I've
none.
heard that too. That's interesting. Yeah. All right, folks, we'll see you soon. Come again. Have a good evening.
Thank you, thank you, thank you.
You're welcome.